All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Please welcome to this hearing of the Budget and Finance Committee for Monday, October 2nd, 2017. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the Committee. I'd like to welcome back Mr. Bonand, and Mr. Blumenfield is here as well. We have a quorum, and we are ready to begin. So we're going to first go ahead and take our general public comment and multi-item public comment. So I'm going to call up first Mr. Herman, followed by Mr. Spindler.
And Mr. Chair, would you like to put 3 minutes on the clock for all of the multi-items as well?
I'd like to do 2 minutes and then give them 1 minute for their general public comment, please.
Thank you.
Well, we all know what a whistleblower is, right?
Look it, I have a drug problem. That's a whistleblower, everybody.
Speak to one of the agenda items.
Well, regarding Douglas Wade versus the city of Los Angeles, I believe the matter arises that the plaintiff is innocent and those alleged retaliations against him are true and factual, and that you should blow the whistle. Then I go into item number 2, but it doesn't say it back here, but it says the committee will recess for closed session to government Monica Ramirez regarding the matter of incident involving members of the fucking police, NWA. Niggas with attitude, but let's go on. Item number 3 regarding Downey Brand LLP fucking sue the city of Los Angeles so they can keep borrowing from the pension to replace the financial budget. And then I go into item number 4 because I only got 2 fucking minutes. In the past I had 5, but now I got 2 minus 3.
Speak to the agenda.
Item number 4. Relative to the threat to security of public buildings and threat to the public's right of access, Mr. Herman's public service of public facility shall not be engaged or interrupted or disrupted by any member of this committee. After all, he participates in all public safety meetings to report the viability and benefits for determinants of authorizing, prioritizing the Linux card of similar product for license and sale of recreational medical marijuana. So when you're getting fucked up on Measure 64 for recreation, just thank all the fucking councilmen like Mike Bonin, who sleeps in his closet getting fucked
give him
up.
General public comment time.
Now, just coming back from the Atwater River Committee, we said to the engineer there that the problem is not that the river is dirty. The problem is you allow too many homeless to sleep and infect the environment. So now we have hepatitis A, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and hepatitis D for the dicks that allowed it to go on. So as long as we have assholes that want to make people homeless, design a system to put people who are homeless in our streets, then there's a real reason to engage in 42 U.S.C. 1983 local law. And that's to say, fuck Paul Krikorian for allowing such innovative ideas of encampments in the LA Basin. And to all those who are members of the LA Basin, a shout out to Silver Lake. Fuck you!
Mr. Spindler.
Yes. So thank you so much. Again, thank you. For the survivor of the overdose, Mike Bonin, give him a hand. Yes, thank you so much. And we're legalizing cannabis so that he can get to stepping down from those hard drugs.
Speak to the agenda item.
We are.
No, you're not, and you're disrupting the meeting. If you don't want to speak to the agenda item, I'm going to go to public comment or have to leave.
Fucking item number fucking 1. Douglas Wade versus City of Los Angeles. Whistleblowers. You've been retaliating against whistleblowers for years. When you hear the whistleblower toot his horn, you know your violations are on the record. settle for maximum liability, and hope that the FBI doesn't one day start doing its job and enforcing shit against you. Item 2, Monica Ramirez versus the LAPD. What happened to Monica Rodriguez? We have no fucking idea. Who is Monica Rodriguez? We have no idea. But what I know is I talked to my friends, yes, and I do have them at LAPD. They said the cops are completely, totally innocent, therefore deny the claim on number 2. See the shock? When the LAPD does a good job, we say so. When they don't, well, you know, like Tuesday morning meetings, yes. Item 3, more outside counsel, good. The more you hire, the more you get sued, and the more you get sued, the more you get fucked in the ass legally, which is good for this city. Stop retaliating against public works and sidewalk repair.
1 minute for general public comment.
So now we get to the item of interest, yes. There's a bicycle case. It's set for a hearing and a motion to dismiss this coming Wednesday. The puppet was told that the offer was made in May. Where the fuck is the money for the plaintiff? The plaintiff rode down the fucking sidewalk, flipped, broke his fucking head, and then he's made a remarkable recovery like the other bicycle plaintiffs, especially this particular bicycle plaintiff, who is a Sick La Via sponsor and a campaign donor. You didn't hire outside counsel for that. Conflict of interest everywhere from you scumbags, yes. And this has to stop. So finally, we have to give homage to the fine work of the LAFD for bringing Mike Bonin out of his drug coma. Welcome back, Mr. Drug Addict. Thank you so much, yes.
All right, for those who are newcomers to the Budget and Finance Committee, this is welcome to our world, and I apologize for the offensiveness of the comments that you heard. Unfortunately, this is what we have to bear every meeting. So
almost makes me wish I was in rehab.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and take up item number 4 first. And just because we have one card on that item, members, I was going to recommend item 4, 6, 7, and 8 for consent approval. Item 4 the recommendation would be to concur in the Rules, Election, and Intergovernmental Relations Committee action and approve. But we do have a speaker, Mr. Kevin Sen, who'd like to be heard. Mr. Sen, come on up. Okay. Well, then we'll go ahead and take this item up, and then we'll consider the consent calendar. Item number 4.
Item number 4 is an Office of Finance reports relative to secure cash acceptance operations and city attorney report relative to the threat to security of public buildings and threat to public's right of access to public services or public facilities, per motion Blumenfield-Bonin. Relative to an instruction to finance to report on the viability, benefits, and possible detriments of authorizing, prioritizing, or acquiring a Lynx card or similar product when issuing licenses for sale of recreational or medical marijuana.
So, Mr. Sen, if you don't mind, we'll go ahead and hear the report first, and then you might want to speak to that. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Vivian Swanigan, Assistant City Attorney with the City of Los Angeles.
Todd Bowie, Assistant Director of Finance.
Michael Poon, Principal Tax Compliance Officer.
So before you have a few items, one of which is a report back that Finance has done in conjunction with City Attorney regarding cash acceptance for the cannabis industry. The Rules Committee did act last week to amend Finance's report with additional recommendations. Finance is supportive of the recommendations of the Rules Committee and appreciate your support as such. Available to answer any questions you may have.
Mr. Blumenfield?
Right. my interest in this one is I think we would all be a lot better off as we do this if we got cash out of the system and we went to a cashless system for marijuana. And I wanted to get your sense about how that could work or couldn't work. What percentage now of the business is paid in cash, and how could we save money potentially? We're talking about putting in all sorts of money for security because of all the cash, and yet if we took a portion of that money and invested it in a very small portion in a system that would be cashless, we would not only be safer, but we would save money in the end of the day. And I'd love us to actually go to even a requirement of no cash, but I wanted to get your thoughts on what you think that's a possibility. Is that preferable to have a system that is paid electronically? And do the options that are available now, do they work?
Right. To answer one of your questions, the percent of cash payers has increased significantly for the cannabis industry over the past couple of years. About 2 years ago, it was about 20%. This past year, it was about 50% paid in cash. And so it has grown pretty much exponentially. It is a complex issue. It's certainly something we've been monitoring with regard to the various options that may be available to us. Short of acceptance of the cash, we're sort of looking at multiple strategies here. One of those is that for the time being, while we must accept cash, that we are fully prepared for that, but at the same time looking at those long-term solutions. Certainly have met with various individuals and in various capacities, various institutions, various government entities regarding what is available out there. And so we've seen quite a lot of the different options, including such as the links option that is mentioned in the motion. Obviously, one of the biggest hurdles with regard to financial institutions is the fact that, according to the federal...
Mr. Herman, be quiet. Be quiet or you're going to be instructed to leave. You're disrupting the meeting. Keep quiet. Spindler, you too. Not a sound or else you're out.
That it is under the federal government illegal, and that's one of the big hurdles for a lot of major financial institutions, particularly banks, is their concern regarding effectively money laundering. And so those institutions have generally shied away from engaging.
Do some of these systems like the Link system or things like that? Because I don't know, but I was enamored by the idea of it and what I've seen. You're saying we have to accept cash, but aren't there a lot of folks not using things like these cards to avoid cash? And is it a foregone conclusion that we have to accept cash? Could we not move to a cashless system?
Right. Right now, in the ordinance that's been adopted, it does specify that Office of Finance will accept cash, and so that would be something that would have to be
ordinance?
the ordinance regarding the Measure M. So,
Because we haven't, you mean the draft?
correct.
Okay. That's not law. I'm talking about this because I think we're going to make a lot of changes to the draft ordinance, and this is one of those changes that I think I don't know if we can make, but that's what I'm looking to your guidance to see if we could. So don't accept it as a foregone conclusion that we have to accept cash. Or I don't. If there's a reason if the only reason that we have to is because the draft ordinance says that we do, then that's not good enough. Is there another reason that we have to? Can we not move to a cashless system if we wanted to and chose to do that in the ordinance?
I believe that the council could put regulations into effect that would compel the industry to look for alternative solutions. However, it would be hard for me to say as to the viability of those solutions. I think there are both legal and other policy issues to consider, particularly with regard to how we would go about that. I don't know if I would recommend necessarily engaging as a contractor with any particular firm, so much as to say, here are particular requirements that we would put in place.
Absolutely.
That would...
You never want us to choose a firm, but...
I do want to say that that's probably something that should be researched as far as the legalities of the workings of the federal law with making this a requirement. So I think it's something, it's not an issue that's actually, as far as I know, been researched by my office. And so I think that is something that could use a little research on the legal
fact,
side.
that would be part of the report back, would include legal analysis of that.
Absolutely, and that's what I'm trying to make very clear. I mean, that is exactly the motion, which is report on the viability, benefits, detriments, authorizing, prioritizing this kind of a system. So that's why I wanted to tease it out, because I do think we need to figure that out, and we need to figure it out quickly, because the whole regulations have to be done very quickly. And I see a potential big benefit in doing it earlier, rather than designing a whole system that's based around cash and has all this extra security, and we're going to approve more positions and all this stuff, when that's sort of responding to what's in front of us, which is we know that we have a cash problem, and that's the biggest risk, versus maybe if we do a little something different, we could avoid that cash problem and actually be kind of cutting edge in Los Angeles compared to a lot of other cities. So when would we get the answers to those questions?
I do believe, as the city attorney's office was suggesting, we would need assistance from the city attorney as well as the new department for cannabis to fully respond. But we have done already a substantial amount of work in this area. So for our perspective, from finance's perspective, we have no issues or problems accepting money from these companies. We've in fact provided the requirements for some of them to transmit to us electronically. We have yet to receive payments electronically from any of them, but nevertheless we do have the ability to do so and are quite willing to accept.
Would it not save us a tremendous amount of money to do so?
Correct.
Is that quantifiable, or do you have some overall numbers on that?
If all were required to pay us electronically and we didn't have to accept cash, yes, it would be substantially beneficial to us to do that.
Is there any sort of number you can put on that?
I could, in terms of a forecasted type of scenario. If you look at going out, let's say if we're looking at, we don't know how many businesses will be licensed exactly, but say now if we have 150 or so, if they're all paying cash and the regulations ultimately require them to come in on a monthly basis in order to make payments, you're looking at a substantial number of businesses who have to come in and make payments. Each one of those payments can take about an hour to process, and you require a dual control type of situation, so you need multiple staff dedicated to that function over time, including all the security requirements and supervisory requirements. So I could certainly we've kind of forecasted ahead, but we could certainly put together numbers that would identify once we become a full-fledged payment operation.
And that's just in terms of processing costs.
Correct.
There's the other side of this equation, which I think is even much more valuable to the city, which is, tax evasion and shutting down illegal shops. I mean, the advantage to these kind of cards or this kind of cashless system is that every transaction, it's like our parking lots. We lose so much money on our parking lots when they're not charged, when they're cash. It's the same thing with these shops. We're losing a tremendous amount of money if every one of these transactions, and the way I understand these cards work, is that the moment it's done, we know exactly who bought what when. It allows us to comply with all of the reporting requirements much cheaper and more easily, and it ensures that we're actually getting 100% of what's due us, whereas under the current scenario, you tell me, but most people say we're getting a very much smaller percentage of what's actually due us in terms of legally due us. And so I'd love to see those numbers factored in, because the processing number is great, but to me that's the tail that wags the dog. I mean, the dog is all of these other, the tax evasion dollars, Mr. Herman, that is very distracting to have you making all these faces behind that. Apologize, Mr. Chair. I just seeing you make dog faces and pot noises and all this stuff, but it's not appropriate.
Okay. Officer, can you ask Mr. Herman to leave the room, please? He's continuing to disrupt the meeting after. You don't speak to us unless you're at the mic, period. Have a good day.
Sorry, but I think this is an important discussion to have, and I really appreciate you guys bringing this forward. And that's why I wanted to spend some extra time on it because I see getting some of these answers quicker.
Hold on a second, Mr. Blumenfield, because Mr. Herman is continuing to disrupt the meeting as he leaves. Delaying probably 50 people who are sitting in this room waiting to do actual city business. Spindler, you're next. One sound, you're gone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's easier to concentrate now, but so I want to figure out what those savings are, and not just our process savings, but potentially these other savings, and what the other barriers are. And maybe the question for the city attorney is the challenges that you face in terms of us accepting cash, and the if there was a solution that we could do it without it, would that not be benefit from a city attorney's perspective?
Well, and if I may, that might be something that we might not want to discuss in open session. I would certainly suggest that the city attorney report back on that and make an assessment of whether it's appropriate for open or closed session.
Yeah, I do think that I can give the short answer that even though that might be advantageous in the long run, if that's something that could be implemented, by a year from now, let's just say, thinking things are going to go smoothly. In the meantime, there are some definite liability concerns that would certainly, offset the concerns of what's.
Yeah, with the federal government issue.
Well, no, the liability items that are mentioned in the closed session report would potentially offset whatever the cost is for beefing up the cash acceptance in the meantime. And again, I'm trying to avoid going into.
You may have to go into closed session to understand that better, but.
I think what the city attorney is saying is basically the short-term pressing needs are still there as we work towards the long-term solutions with regard to cash acceptance or other options for receiving monies from that industry. So I think in support of the short-term recommendations made by a committee.
And that's where I'm part of the reason for this motion is that my intuition is that, and I could be wrong, but is that if we were to actually look at this as a short-term problem, I mean, in terms of dealing with getting the cash out of the system and not thinking of it as that's what we'll do down the road, we might save a lot of time and money on the short term in terms of all the preparations we're making for the nightmare of all of this cash in our system and the security issues and all the rest. Whereas if we actually had a way to take that out, we might save a lot of money up front rather than wait for the long term. So I'd love to see if there's a way to do this on the short term, to look at it on the short term as well as, yes, moving to that down the road.
I think one of the biggest questions will come back to the city attorney's opinion regarding the issue of receiving money through those types of systems. As for finance, like I said, we're fully prepared to receive money in that fashion, and it does benefit us from an audit perspective as well to have that type of electronic records in place. But there are a few obviously questions or hurdles that would have to be addressed as well.
Yes, the safety concerns, whether you're talking about OSHA or workplace violence, these are the concerns that bring us, to the point where we would have a closed session or even qualify for a closed session.
And we're agendized for closed session today on this. So if you'd like, we can, because that's going to be next, we can bring this back in closed session and have them.
Let's do that.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So why don't we go ahead and hear from Mr. Sen now, though, in case he doesn't want to stick around. Good afternoon, sir. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm Kevin Sen. I'm from Lynx Card Inc., and I'd like to applaud this committee and the council's vision and foresight to see what kind of issues might be out there for the city to accept cash for marijuana tax payments from what could likely be many more than 150 shops, and what it might mean for the safety and well-being of your constituents and your employees and personnel here in the city offices. We are able currently to take marijuana cannabis sales at all the dispensaries legally through credit and debit, convert those sales into electronic money, and remit the taxes to the city electronically. We're FinCEN and BSA compliant, and from what I'm hearing, I'd just like to offer that both our legal and our logistics teams as a resource to the city attorney and to the director of finance in any of the investigation that's going on to look into this, and also would also offer that if we don't know this already, is that the city or the state of Hawaii has already mandated a cashless system, not only for purchases but for taxes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Well then, members, if we can defer further discussion on this until closed session, we'll take action following closed session when we're back in open. So we'll just hold item 4 on the table for now. Then items 6, 7, and 8, I would recommend for consent approval, unless there's objections or questions. Seeing none, it'll be the action of the committee to approve the recommendations on those items. And then that will bring us to closed session. City Attorney, have any requests for priority on closed session? We'll go ahead and go in numerical order, starting with item number 1 then, please. So if you're here on item 1, come on up. I'd like to ask everybody else to go ahead and exit the room.
No, we didn't say 6, 7. Thank you. Yeah. Hi there, Harry. I'm sorry? No. Oh. Yeah.
If you're not here on item number 1, I need to ask you to leave the room immediately, please, so we can proceed with our meeting. All right, we are back in open session, and we are still considering item number 4. There has been discussion about that item both in open session and closed session. We've completed public comment on that item. Mr. Blumenfield, did you want to request an action on this item?
So the action on this item would be accept the recommendations put forward, but we specify that we get the report back no later than 30 days. We want it as soon as possible, but no later than 30 days. And the report to be back from finance and city attorney working in collaboration, as well as making sure to broaden the cost-benefit analysis to include not just the processing costs, but all of the other related costs of having the cash in the system, et cetera, that are outlined in the report.
Okay, and otherwise to concur in the rules election and IG Relations Committee action on this aspect of the item. So.
Yep.
All right. There any objection? Seeing none, that will be the action of the committee. Thank you very much. And that will bring us to item number 5.
Item number 5 is the City Administrative Officer reports relative to cannabis business fees and interim position authorities to implement the cannabis regulations within the city. On September 25th, 2017, the Rules, Elections, and Intergovernmental Relations Committee took various actions.
And do we have any cards on this item?
No, Mr. Chair.
All right. Public comment on this item is closed. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Jason Clean on behalf of the CAO's office. Before you today is a supplemental report from the Office of the City Administrative Officer, which includes recommendations to establish interim position authority for city departments involved in the administration of application processes for Prop D compliant businesses, establishes fees for special services tied to those processes, establishes a systems development fee to defray the systems development and technology costs associated with the regulation of cannabis businesses, and establishes a special revenue fund for the receipt, retention, and disbursement of fees relating to the regulation of cannabis businesses within the City of Los Angeles. As amended by the Rules Committee, our office was instructed to work with associated departments on additional fees and position authorities for supporting departments as well as an enforcement mechanism. We are to work with the Department of Cannabis Regulation on inspections and compliances for licensed businesses. In the original CAO report, those functions were actually going to be done by the Los Angeles Police Department in the current fiscal year. However, given the timing of the state licensing system, which is expected to start issuing licenses sometime in March or April of next year, and having talked with Kat in the Personnel Department, we believe that we could actually implement civilian classifications in the current fiscal year and get those filled in advance of the inspections being due. And then to appropriate funds for the included positions for other departments, which included the Office of Finance, the Department of Cannabis Regulation, and to report back with position authorities for the police department as well as the city attorney for an enforcement program.
Okay. Ms. Packard, did you want to speak to this separately or add anything else?
No, not at the moment.
Okay. The big question, I mean, I think it's a good start for as an interim staff plan, and as we've discussed, I always like to have the boss in place and start to figure out what your needs will be before we go full bore with a staffing plan, and we're starting to do that. I think the big question I would have on this is what our vision is for the longer term for the enforcement part of this. And this is more an organizational than a budgetary issue, but where is that responsibility, where would you envision that responsibility best housed? And how do we most cost effectively ensure that there's going to be enforcement of whatever the regulatory scenario is that we end up adopting?
I believe that it makes sense to have the Department of Cannabis Regulation serve as the gatekeeper to determine which businesses or applicants should be licensed. Once these businesses are licensed and in the purview of the department would be the leading agency responsible for enforcement related to compliance against these businesses. For unlicensed businesses, though, it makes sense to have the Los Angeles Police Department and the city attorney be lead agencies against unlicensed and unauthorized activity in the city.
And talk about what the pluses and minuses on that would be. Why that distinction?
I believe that in moving forward with this regulatory framework, and I do believe that it's the intention of the LAPD as well to differentiate between what activity is illegal and what activity is legal. Allowing the department to handle enforcement related to compliance makes sense because these are the entities that are going to be reviewing compliance on a regular basis. These are the folks that are going to have the most easy access to the application processing. These are the folks that will be housed in the department and working with the commission as they're making these policies and developments. So the subject matter expertise as it relates to compliance in a regulatory framework will be housed within the department. Moving forward, because this department is civilian, I don't think that it makes sense to have the cannabis department going around and trying to identify unlicensed activity. I think that it makes sense to have the folks who have been responsible for enforcement up to this point continue to lead enforcement against illegal activity, having LAPD and city attorney serve as those leading agencies, particularly because of some of the ramifications and kind of background that this industry has had with LAPD and city attorney. I also think that it makes sense to house those responsibilities in terms of compliance within the department, just because I feel as though everyone will be more comfortable, in a sense, moving forward in a regulatory framework, having compliance enforcement fall under the purview of the cannabis department rather than having a heavy hand of enforcement coming from LAPD and city attorney.
Okay. Members? Mr. Loonfield.
A couple things. The proposed fees, how do they compare to similar fees for approvals from the planning department? Are they?
In terms of entitlement fees, the fees are actually lowered because this is being treated more similarly to a ministerial function as opposed to a discretionary function. As we're routing the application through the new Excel system, a lot of the application and the checks and balances are going to be automated, where the system itself is actually identifying whether or not the site location is geospatially located within a buffer zone or within any of the buffers from other businesses. We're also going to be looking at whether or not the applicant has filled out all the fields. Basically, by submitting the application electronically, it's going to reduce the staff time spent on trying to check to see whether or not an application is complete, because the system will not allow somebody to submit an incomplete application. So those fees are going to be lower. And then, Ms. Packer, as she's moving forward with designing the back end of this process, once an applicant comes back with their state license, she'll have the opportunity to determine how much regulation should be imposed on different license types. The initial CO report is really focused on the Prop D businesses and getting them the opportunity to submit their applications in advance of December 31st so they can be part of the first rung of state licensees, which was dictated by Proposition M, but then also giving her the opportunity to look at the other license types and how those should be phased in. So when we executed the contract with Excella, we took an iterative approach where the phase one is really focused on the Prop D businesses in that application process, and then she has the ability to phase in the other license types as policy decisions get made.
So would there be different, would the fee change?
The initial piece is not actually going to be different because we had already anticipated that the new system was going to do the bulk of the application review and then the scheduling for the commission, and then the back end in terms of how often these businesses would be inspected, what types of inspections would be done. Those were going to be more labor intensive, and that's why we redacted those fees from the CO report.
Okay. Maybe this, so, and I was also confused. There's an application fee and a plan review fee. How are they different?
So the application review fee is really focused on what it takes to get to a complete application and get that scheduled for the commission. The plan review fee is going to be looking at some of those ancillary things as to whether or not the physical structure meets the building code. What is the security plan and review for that actual physical structure? A lot of the things that LAPD was going to be looking at under the original model, which was front-loaded in terms of camera placement, video surveillance systems, all that other stuff, that's going to be dealt with by the department now.
And the fees also, so that's the plan
That's
fee.
the plan review, yes.
That's the plan review versus
the application.
And I guess there's different activities or different that are going on. Some require hearings, some don't. So it seems like depending on the activity, it could be very different cost of processing. Does that mean also that there would be different fees for the activity base?
Potentially. So these fees are good for the Prop D compliant businesses and processing those applications. And as the policy decisions get made and we develop the workflows for the other license types and non-Prop D businesses, those may have different fees associated with them based on the time and materials that it takes to process those applications and then get them through the process.
All right, and that's something we would look at down the road, I guess.
Correct.
Okay. And how do we know that the fees are accurate? Can we change them if they're too low or lower them if they're too high?
So the fees are actually scaled based on time and materials. So the staffing provided to the department plus the cost of the system assumed that we were going to deal with about 150 to 200 licenses during the phase one, which was the 2017 BTRC holders. If we get additional applications coming through because we expand the Prop D pool to 2016, 2015, whatever it happens to be, we can then scale the department's staffing model to actually accommodate that. So the fees scale based on the number of applications, but there would be an additional personnel impact as we start to accept additional license types.
And so that would change the fee per type?
It wouldn't change the fee per type because the time and the cost that goes into reviewing the application is already baked in. What it would do is we would get additional revenues for processing the additional applications that we could then allocate for additional personnel to actually process the applications as well as the hearings.
Right, but the fee stays.
The fee would stay the same for these that are in the report.
Have we ever thought about doing, sometimes we also, we take a deposit, and then if actual time it takes us is less, we give a refund, and if time is more, we ask for extra money so that it actually reflects the unique process that fee that's required. Have we thought about doing that for this, or is there a reason to do it or not to do it?
We have thought about doing that, but currently we don't have any data to go off of. So we assume that the Prop D compliant businesses were by and large going to be similar application types and similar hearing types, and we were going to basically look at the time and material spent in processing those applications over the next fiscal year. And then as we develop the workflows for the other license types, we would determine the hours of work and effort that go into processing those, and we'd have separate fees. So for the other license types or other dispensary types, we may have a tiered system where a retail dispensary that's between 1,000 and 1,500 square feet pays one license fee, and then another retail establishment that's between 5,000 and 6,000 square feet has a higher fee because there's going to be additional cameras. The inspections at those locations are going to take longer periods of time. There's going to be additional compliance on those. It's really going to be based on the end product.
And it could be also whether they're growing or they're doing medical and recreational or whatever their
correct
unique thing. Last fee-related question: do we need to establish an appeal fee? Because there's going to be some appeal process, right? Do we have such a thing?
Currently, we do not. It's something we anticipate bringing back either before the end of the calendar year or sometime first quarter. We anticipated that the appeal fee would have to be in place once the public hearing was held, and we anticipated that the public hearing was going to be held sometime after the applicant got through the initial application process.
Okay, and then this comes up in Plum on other projects. We have to decide whether, because we have full cost recovery on most of these fees, but on appeals fees it starts to get a little tricky. Do we subsidize the appeal fee of a non-applicant? So the community, somebody's approved and the community then wants to file an appeal, do they pay the same appeal fee as the applicant would pay if they're not approved and they file an appeal?
I believe that will be a policy decision. So when the CO's office does the fee analysis, we'll bring forward what the fee would be for the applicant as well as a non-applicant, and that would generally be recommended at full cost recovery. And then Ms. Packer, as well as this committee, would have the opportunity to weigh in as to whether or not that fee should be set lower than full cost recovery.
And when does that happen? Because this is the report, the interim report, I guess. So when does all that happen?
So there's going to be a series of follow-up reports that are going to be coming in over the next few months as the land use piece is finalized, as the regulatory processes start to be finalized. Things that are going to happen after an applicant submits their application, we do the initial plan review, determining whether or not we give some kind of local approval to the applicant to move on to applying for a state license, because ultimately if an applicant is unsuccessful in getting a state license, they can't operate within the city legally come January 1st, 2018. So how much work should the city do on the front end before the state actually determines whether or not they would find that applicant eligible for licensure?
I'm just worried about time. we all are. I mean, it's October now. According to the state, we need to have this done by January, what's January 18th or January 1st?
January 1.
January 1, okay. That's 3 months, and people are going to be applying, paying a fee. They need to be applying before January 1 potentially, or I guess on January 1. We need to have our stuff done by January 1, right? And then they apply starting January 1.
They would have the opportunity to apply for local licensure prior to January 1st. The intent was to open it up for the Prop D compliant businesses in advance. The city selected Excella, and we plan to utilize their Civic platform, which is being utilized by the state of California, and it's currently implemented in the state of Colorado as well as the city of Denver for the application processing. And that would.
So timing-wise, it's October now. Folks are going to be applying in November, December?
Correct.
So the future reports that we're talking about in terms of the appeal fees and all that other stuff, I mean, that's future needs to be like within the next 30 days.
Well,
or am I wrong?
It depends on the phasing. It depends on the phasing for how individuals would move through the city's process. So kind of as discussed now, an applicant comes in, they're running a Prop D compliant business. They submit their application through the DCR website. That application gets vetted. They go through a plan check review. Then they get a local license, or they get authority to apply for their state license. They apply for their state license. They're in parallel of them applying for the state license, the city is going to be finalizing its rules and regulations at the local level. And once those rules and regulations are finalized, we can do the fee analysis necessary and bring those forward. And we anticipate having the back end of this process, which is all of the clearances, the inspections, the renewal fees, the appeal fees, being in place by March or April, so that as the first set of state licenses, are issued, we have the rest of our process built, and that's when the applicant would come back to the city to go through the final licensure process locally.
Under the current version of the regulations, it only anticipates moving those Prop D priority folks through the system prior to January 1st. So as we're approaching this conversation, there is a limited category of folks that we're talking about setting initial systems up for first. Determinations beyond that first window of Prop D priority processing, there's a lot of discretion as to when we actually implement that licensing function. So that'll be a policy decision as to when we actually phase in those other license types beyond the Prop D folks that we anticipate.
You're just talking about dispensaries. I mean, what about cultivators and all the other folks?
So those policy decisions are still being made because as of right now, the Prop D priority folks, when they're applying for their local authority, they will essentially get 3 bites at the apple. They'll be able to apply for 3 license types at once. They'd be able to apply for retail, delivery, and cultivation, because those are essentially the activity types that they were allowed to conduct under Prop D. So some of there have been conversations about, if we just have retail operators, how are we going to make sure that those operators have the supply chain that they need? And so I do believe that by allowing these operators to get both delivery, retail, and cultivation licenses, that we take care of some of that issue. But there are larger policy decisions that need to be made as to how do we make sure that the supply chain is fully functional in the interim. And I know that part of that consideration.
Sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I know that part of that consideration is the social equity program and the ability for the social equity program to be up and running by the time that we issue general licenses outside of the Prop D window.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly part of the problem. And then also, as you mentioned, the supply chain. As I understand, I visited one of the dispensaries in my district recently, and they were supposedly one of the most, they grow more than all the rest. They still only 40% of their supply, and they said they're one of the largest in terms of that, comes from what they grow. That means even on the biggest growing dispensary, assuming they're accurate, the majority of their product is coming from somewhere else in the supply chain. And so, as you're pointing out, if we don't have a licensure system in place, then we're either pushing all those folks out, or we're encouraging the illegal activity, or we're putting the folks in a very awkward position of either they have to shut down in order to get licensed, but then I don't know. I guess all of that is, all of those problems could be solved if we resourced up in a very rapid way and moved forward quicker. And if we were able to do that, even on an interim basis, we could resolve a lot of these problems, which are clearly going to happen on January, February, March.
I think that part of the consideration that's being made, particularly in figuring out what we want to do with cultivators and manufacturers, is that a lot of these cultivators and manufacturers are in operation right now. So determining what position the city wants to take against these folks who have been doing unauthorized activity. Do we, so to speak, grandfather these businesses in and allow them to continue to operate while their application is being processed, and what those implications are? And I want to note that one of those implications, depending on the language of how we grandfather these businesses in, could be considerations of over-concentration, particularly because with the Prop D folks, we're allowing them to we're grandfathering their locations in. And so any location that we grandfather is not going to have the same zoning or sensitive use barriers that we're enacting for everyone else. So just a note that in these conversations about how we move forward with this, that I think that one of the policy considerations is going to be over concentration and grandfathering if we don't require these businesses to meet the same sensitive use and zoning requirements that businesses are going to have to face moving forward.
And if we grandfather them in during the interim period, we're going to face all the liabilities that they have in terms of using pesticides on their product, all the stuff. Half of them are probably doing terrible things in terms of the way they do things. So, I don't know. The best scenario is if we move quickly and figure out a way to, whether it's contracting out with like some other states have done, where they have, companies that come in that help you get up and running and deal with a lot of these issues quickly, and then we can kind of tweak it as we go, but to not to either not license and then have that interim period where people have to operate in the shadows, or to go really slowly, presents a lot of, you know better than the rest of us, presents a lot of policy challenges and liabilities for us as a city.
And I think that just we are in the same position with the state. So the state is trying to figure out how it's going to scale up its practices in anticipation of not being able to properly vet these businesses. The state is very actively relying on local control to serve as that vetting function. And the reason why I say that is that originally, when the state regulations were articulated, it was only anticipated that businesses who had gotten local approval prior to January 1st, 2018 would be able to move forward in the process. That since has changed to say that now the state is going to issue temporary licenses to any business that gets local approval, regardless if it happens before January 1st or not, because the state anticipates only giving temporary licenses during the year of 2018. So we probably won't see the state have the ability to do this full vetting process until 2019. So what type of vetting process, public health precautions are we going to instill into these regulations up front, knowing that the state temporary license is basically a paper license. There's going to be no on-site inspection that these businesses are going to have to go through. Everything is going to be on paper beyond local approval.
You see any feasible way that we could do this, quick enough to avoid these, the timing problem, that we could ramp up very quickly to get not just the dispensaries, but the other related businesses licensed?
I think it's a balancing act between trying to best serve community members who were told that there would be proper vetting systems in place for these businesses. I think that once the social equity analysis comes out and the Foundation for the Social Equity Program comes on board, there are real implications to grandfathering these businesses that might not be compatible with the social equity program, particularly because if we, even if we're just looking at these businesses who are on compliant land, if we sit here and we grandfather these businesses into their locations, essentially the pie could be gone before social equity or general applicants even get a bite at the apple. So I think it's a balancing act that policy decision needs to be made. I do think that there's a space for compromise in the middle. I'm still trying to figure out what that looks like.
And building on...
When does the social equity stuff that piece get moved forward?
So the social equity analysis should be available in its final version within the next 2 weeks.
And building on what Ms. Packer said, one of the reasons why we chose a commercial off-the-shelf system for the application and licensing system was the system's already in place in another state, another city, as well as being utilized by the state of California. So the business rules at the state level and all the different license types are already being coded into the system. So basically, once we decide that we want to move forward with various license types, it's just going to come down to the city configuring that system and putting our business rules and whatever logic we want to apply for that. And the intention is to have a lot of the application process be automated through the system, and we can get that up and running probably in 30 to 60 days from the point at time we finalize those policy decisions.
Thank you.
Mr. Bonner?
No question. Just wanted to comment on the social equity analysis. You said it'll be out in about 2 weeks?
Yes.
How do you intend to get that discussion out there beyond just a committee room? I ask because, you know, when I talk to constituents about the social equity implications, it's not something that folks get right away. And I saw a Facebook Live clip from Mr. Harris Dawson the other day at an event where the two of you were, where he made the case very well. But I think it's, because it's going to be an important element of this policy, that's going to be something that needs to be articulated better and widely. And I'm just wondering, even though it's slightly off topic, how you intend to do that.
I think that it's going to require a strong education and public information campaign, outreach campaign. The public workshop that the department held over the weekend, with only 11 days to organize and get the word out, we had a venue that sat 500 and had at least 40 people standing. So there is large interest from the community in hearing more information. I think that it's going to require kind of thinking outside of the box and approaching business chambers in these communities, approaching non-traditional community-based organizations. But I think if a strategy is developed and employed immediately, as soon as that analysis came out, that there would be widespread support and folks would be able to latch on.
Let's talk a little bit offline. Thanks.
Members, I'd also like to invite up, we have representatives of the police department, the fire department, I think building and safety here as well. If you'd like to come and offer any comments that each of you may have on whether on enforcement or other issues that are relevant to this hiring plan. Captain Carmona, welcome.
Well, if I could just offer one perspective, I think that would be for the success of the licensing retailers, it's absolutely important that we shut down those operating illegally. And I think the fear is that that number is so large, it's going to be difficult, especially the first year, to taper that down and to eliminate the illegal retailers. It's my belief, I think we're probably have 500 or 600 non-Prop D compliant retailers out there now, and I believe that's still expanding in the race to get a license. So I think that's going to be the biggest issue for at least on the retail end. There'll be other issues with the cultivators. But, and Chief Beck has made this position clear as far as the staffing of the positions in the LAPD. You know, the LAPD right now is going through a little bit of a personnel, I won't say crisis, but an issue with moving people or personnel from the specialized units and putting them back in patrol. And the department right now, it's not feasible to staff separate positions. So we're currently looking at a model of overtime to accomplish the goals of shutting down the illegal dispensaries.
Okay. And I guess this is not an issue for today. This is more of a budget issue that we'll talk about over the longer haul. But, well, it is relevant today because if we're looking at full cost recovery for these, in the way these fees have been calculated, does any of the potential need for police resources, are those calculated into this? If we do have to go to an overtime model, which I agree with the captain is of benefit to the licensees to get rid of illegal operators, is there sufficient nexus, number one, and number two, if there is, has that already been calculated in?
In the original August CO report, we did institute a code violation inspection fee. That fee was approximately $20,000, which actually took into account the resources necessary to actually go in to an illegal operation, inventory any of the product there, do the inspections, call in any of the other associated city agencies that would be involved in that investigation. So we have done an initial analysis. When we do move forward, the code violation inspection fee will probably in that neighborhood, which would be separate and apart from the $20,000 a day fine that was established by Proposition M. There are conversations with Ms. Packer as to whether or not there should be a tiered system for the enforcement, where if you had somebody who was theoretically thought they were property compliant, was operating, if somebody went in and issued them a code violation and told them to suspend operations, that would be a lesser amount than somebody who was issued an initial citation to shut down and refused to shut down and continued operating, would probably be hit with the larger cost, where LAPD did have to come in, send out a team, inventorize, confiscate, and then submit all the reports. So we're currently talking about how we can do a tiered system to kind of look at what type of offense occurred, so that not everybody gets hit with that large $21,000 fee.
Yeah, well, and another way that maybe there is to deal with that is because the code violation inspection fee model has, created a lot of problems in current code inspection situations where somebody has what they think is a minor violation. They get this big fee because they're the ones that somebody complains about. Then maybe they didn't get notice of the fee, so then it triples, and all of a sudden it's a very onerous thing. And we deal with this with every single council meeting with some of these fees. And I'm wondering if we couldn't make the nexus argument that inspection of violators is a cost that should be borne by all operators. So it should be built into the initial licensing fee in the first place, maybe some portion in addition to that, because this would actually lower than the cost of the violation fee for those, rather in addition to the tiered system you're talking about. If some portion of that cost is borne by all operators, if it's spread across all operators, then you have a sustainable revenue source that can be used for police overtime that will benefit those very operators. It would be kind of like if we had a special anti-counterfeiting detail to go work Santee Alley, which, by the way, we used to have, and I'd love to see again. But if we had that, and the cost of that were borne by the trademark owners, because they're the ones benefiting from it. In this situation, I'm all for trying to get cost recovery once somebody complains and there's an inspection, but it seems to me in order to have a more robust inspection, a response from LAPD, it would be better to have that cost spread. But it's something we should weigh anyway, I think.
We've thought about that, and the way it would work in the proactive system is civilian inspectors from not only the Department of DCR, but Building and Safety and Office of Finance, as they're having their auditors, their tax compliance folks, their inspectors, whether it's a building mechanical inspector or one of the inspectors for the cannabis department, as those folks are out there in the field looking at compliant businesses and license types, and those businesses are paying for their own inspection fees, they'll know whether or not there's somebody who's illegally operating, because we'll have the geospatial mapping for all of the licensed ones, and then they can make a referral to LAPD, and then LAPD will be responding to more of a verified call where somebody is in fact operating an illegal type of business. So the resources expended are not being expended in a building and safety manner where it's just private members of the public calling and complaining about something. Somebody has done a little bit of vetting initially before LAPD is sent out to respond.
So there would be, so this hiring plan would have sufficient resources to do that kind of proactive civilian inspection, you know, not just of the licensees, but more broadly to find out where there are potential illegal operators, and then make those referrals to LAPD.
Right. I mean, when they're driving to their inspection sites for the licensed businesses, they're going to notice illegal operators. When you look at weed maps and some of the other mapping systems that are out there, you're going to have operators that are not legal and licensed. So when you compare the data sets, it's going to become very apparent very quickly who's a licensed operator and who's an unlicensed operator, and then it comes out to the enforcement piece.
Yeah, but being a parent is different than having that be assigned as part of their responsibility, because, you know, we see it all the time in other departments where my job is to do this, not to look at that. And if they see their mission as being to go out to the licensees and deal with them, that's an entirely different model than if part of their mission is in fact to go out and proactively inspect neighborhoods and see there's supposed to be one there but not over there. And if that's incorporated, and I, you know, actually should be directing this to Ms. Packer, because would your vision be with these resources that they would be able to meet that need as well, to be proactive about that kind of inspection and create a body of referrals then for the illegal operators to LAPD?
As I had originally had anticipated the responsibilities of the department, I did not foresee them participating in an active search for unlicensed activity. I don't, depending on the activity that's happening in these locations, particularly because a lot of these locations that are unauthorized might have armed security personnel on staff. I don't anticipate that it makes sense to have a civilian Department of Cannabis Regulation going out and actively searching for those types of activity types. I also wanted to add that I think that the weed maps function it's helpful for dispensaries. And I don't think that those are the harder license type to find. I think that what is going to be the challenge for the city is to find these cultivators and manufacturers who do not have storefront foot traffic going in and out. And I think that we're going to have to think creatively about how we mount up enforcement strategies around these particular activity types.
And that may be an even better example. If you're in the cultivation business, seems to me that your fees should be robust enough to include fully reimbursing LAPD for all of their overtime to inspect the entire city for illegal grows. I mean, that should just be cost of doing business, because otherwise it's not going to get done unless they take people out of patrol in my neighborhood, and that's entirely 100% unacceptable to all of us. I'm going to go ahead and speak for both of you. So someone has to do this proactive inspection. And I think you're 100% right. Those are the more potentially problematic areas even than retail dispensaries, which would be pretty much visible by a drive-by. But the other operations, not so much so. And whether in your hiring plan or in the fee component to be able to support others' hiring plans. It just has to be a part of this. So I'm going to open it up, but I also want to hear from fire and building and safety. But go ahead.
Just to add to that, to the point that you're making as a follow-up. I mean, you're absolutely right. The dispensaries are easy. They're here we are. They're on weed maps. You can just pick them off your phone. But once we actually license the cultivators and the manufacturers, they're going to rat out each other. So it's going to be very hard at the beginning when we're trying to, if we're trying to enforce before we've licensed. But once we license, I think there's going to be a very strong self-policing within the industry. I would think, but you can let me know if I'm wrong on that.
I believe that's the case. I think that the concern would be in terms of trying to, I think it's in the city's best interest to, at least in the beginning, try and capture as many folks as possible in the regulated market, to have businesses identify themselves willingly and give them an opportunity to either say, we know that you exist, you're either going to come into conformance or you need to shut down. Because in the city of Los Angeles, the businesses that are authorized and the businesses that are authorized only represent about 8% of what I think is the actual size of the market. My concern would be whatever cost was associated with passing the cost of shutting down 90% of the market to that 8%, particularly when we're trying to get these folks to come on board.
Mr. Bonin? Sorry, I didn't mean to take this on such a detour. But
Royce Long, Los Angeles Fire Department. So I'll just make a quick comment. For us, enforcement is fire code, but there's also a state program that we regulate, and that's hazmat disclosure, the community right to know. And so the penalties, any enforcement we do with that will be outside of these proposed regulations. It'll be a standalone enforcement system. And just one other thing too, with the Excella system, that's something the fire department's already on in the Cooper program, which is that state program. It's not the Civic platform, it's more of their it's their inspection system that downloads onto our laptops. But we're having conversations this week with Excella about moving on to the Civic platform, which will integrate really nicely with the Department of Cannabis Regulation.
Okay. All right. Anything further on this, members?
I'll go on this. David Myers with the Fire Department, Fire Development Services. We issue permits for businesses that have industrial processes with hazardous materials. Some of the concerns that we have with the cannabis extraction industry would be the flammable solvents that they use to extract the oils. So we have a process where we can issue a permit. However, we haven't really developed guidelines for the cannabis industry yet to identify all the hazards. So we're working with the LA County Fire Department, some of the other agencies who've done this already to ensure that these businesses are conducted safely without having a fire and explosion hazard.
Okay.
So, and then we do have a fee system established already for these specific action permits.
Good. So it would not be a challenge to scale up your operation based on those fees if those would be recovered by the new entries into the market.
I wouldn't say it would not be a challenge. It'll be a learning experience. So it'll be something that progresses over time. We'll have to see how it works out.
Okay. All right. Very good. If there's nothing else, members, then I think to your point about urgency, Mr. Blumenfield, obviously there's a million things still to be worked out. And this is going to change. It's going to evolve. Once we decide what the regulatory framework is going to be, staffing needs are going to change. And none of this is carved in stone, but I think this is a good start. And I don't want to hold up getting started in getting us to that finish line. So if there's no objection, I'd propose that we concur in the Rules, Elections, and Intergovernmental Relations Committee recommendations, but amending them to strike the 4 tax auditor 2s insofar as those positions are duplicative of the action that we previously took on item number 4. So if that's okay with you, that will be the action of the committee. So thank you all very much. Thank you for your patience. That brings us to item number 9.
Prior to the next item, regarding item number 6, as the ordinance was submitted after the matter was considered by Public Works and Gang Reduction, would the chair like to clarify that we are approving the revised or dated September 26, 2017, and order filed the previous or dated August 31st, 2017? An ord was actually submitted after Public Works and Gang Reduction heard the item.
Okay.
So just to clarify that we're hearing the new ord, and we're approving the new ord, not the old ord.
Yes, ITGSC also previously approved this, right?
I believe
Are we on item number 6?
6 was heard by Public Works and Gang Reduction Committee.
Okay. Yeah, okay. All right, I'll take your word for it. Okay, so item number 9.
Item number 9 is the City Administrative Officer reports relative to the sale of city-owned surplus property located at 1611 South Beloit Avenue, Los Angeles Department of Transportation DOT Municipal Off-Street Parking Lot 654 to Quattro SM/Beloit Partners LLC for $1,848,000 and related actions.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So I don't know if Mr. Bonin, you wanted to speak to this first since this involves your district, but I guess go ahead and offer a brief report because I know Mr. Bonin's on a tight frame, but my main concern is if we were to move forward with this as it's recommended, chances are it would not have any impact because there's usually, we can anticipate a surplus towards the end of the year. But if there were additional needs for SPRF funding, or if there were not a surplus, the backstop for this would be reimbursement from the general fund, I would assume. So that's my main concern. So I'd like to kind of have an explanation of the math to make sure that that's not going to be an issue.
Councilman David Hirano with the Office of CAO. I think you do understand the SPRF correctly. The surplus that's budgeted for 17-18 budget from SPRF was not calculated with this in mind. So this transaction would be an additional surplus, assuming everything else matches the budget as we move through the course of the year. Every year there are ups and downs in the different accounts within DOT and within the Special Parking Revenue Fund. And so we're precluded from actually declaring and moving the surplus until the fourth quarter of the year. So there is a possibility that if we end up short overall, that this could end up impacting the general fund. However, there's also a possibility that we could end up with a little bit of a surplus in the fourth quarter as well. So it's, it's just, I don't know if I could tell you the likelihood of it going one way or the other at this point.
So I think there's one point on this, and maybe you know this, Mr. Bonnet, that originally I think there were funds budgeted from SPRF for the replacement lot, and I don't know if that was in this budget year or not, but that presumably would not be necessary now, right? So that would be a savings in the SPRF of whatever had been budgeted for an expenditure for the replacement lot. Is that true? Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, right now there's no funds associated for a replacement lot, at least not to my knowledge.
Okay. But had that originally been anticipated and budgeted for in the SPRF?
I could answer that question. Jackie Wagner with the CAO's office. So originally in 2009, when the council took the action to authorize the direct sale of this property, there was not a replacement location that was identified. And in fact, I believe Department of Transportation requested the flexibility to be able to determine what their priorities were at the time and if there was a need for a replacement lot.
Okay.
So this was back in 2009. And then, of course, we just consummated the sale, or we are attempting to finalize the sale. And so similar to what was intended back in 2009 when the original instructions were given, we're leaving it up to the Department of Transportation to determine what their needs are at this point in time. And these funds, I should note, are unbudgeted and unanticipated for the 17-18 budget year.
Okay. Okay. Anything else, Mr. Bonnet, on this? Mr. Bloomfield? Okay. I'm going to go ahead and recommend approval without
I'm
objection.
sorry, Councilman.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I do have one minor change. In addition to the recommendations that were read into the record at the ITGS, we do have one additional other adjustment.
Okay.
And it is that on item CF, we need to reduce the allocation of $900,000 to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund by $10,000 so that we can set aside monies for escrow fees. So it would be $10,000 for escrow fees, for JC escrow fees.
Okay.
And $890 to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund instead.
Okay. Anything else, members? Okay. As amended, then, it will be the action of the committee to approve the recommendations. Is there any other business before the committee? Seeing none, we are adjourned.